I am going to turn then to our next speaker, Daniel Greenbaum from the Health Effects Institute. He is the president and leads the efforts to provide public and private decision makers across the world with high quality, impartial, relevant, and credible science about the health effects of air pollution to inform air quality decisions. Again, he has a much longer bio that is available online, but I will turn the floor over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And let me pull up my slides, and hopefully those will show up in proper form shortly. And you should be able to see those now. Is that correct? Great. Well, thanks very much to the academies for organizing this and inviting me to speak. I am going to speak about the experience of the Health Effects Institute and a little more directly about how we have gained sponsor support but maintained scientific independence of those sponsors, which I think is a very important topic that this whole several days is spending time on. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we try to build trusted science, often to inform controversial decisions, briefly summarizing HAI's origins and structure, some key elements of how we preserve independence, some examples of our HAI science in action, and some closing thoughts. First, conflict of interest. I am a full-time employee of the Health Effects Institute. We are a 501c3 nonprofit research institute. And HAI's funds, from which my compensation is drawn, come from a variety of sources. Our core air pollution and health funds come from 2 offices in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and in equal amount from the motor vehicle industry, which is 24 domestic and international vehicle and engine companies doing business in the United States. We have a global health program with funding from the Clean Air Fund and Children's Investment Fund foundations, both in London. Those are private philanthropies. And we also have a separate HEI energy program, which I won't focus on so much today, which has funding from both the U.S. EPA Office of Research and Development and from members of the U.S. oil and gas industry. As I will describe, all sponsors of HEI provide input along with the scientific and environmental communities into the priority topics HEI should address, but they have no role in selecting teams to conduct the research, overseeing the implementation of that research, or reviewing the results of the research prior to publication. So where did HEI start? It actually started with amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1977, a section called 202A4, in which vehicle companies were required to test the health effects of emissions from their vehicles. At the time, the EPA and industry relationship was poor. There was dueling and defensive science, and a lot of money being spent, but not necessarily advancing understanding on the health effects of those emissions. So in the 78 and 79, the then EPA Administrator Doug Costel and industry CEOs met and thought there must be a better way to produce this science. And based on that, in 1980, the Health Effects Institute was launched. We've been around now for over 40 years. We do have balanced core support from US EPA and the worldwide motor vehicle industry. We've also built partnerships over many years with the World Health Organization, Asian Development Bank, the US FHWA, and other industries. We have an independent board, which is agreed to by the administrator and core industry sponsors. And our original board was made up of Archibald Cox, the then Watergate prosecutor, Donald Kennedy, who had just stepped down of being a regulator as the FDA commissioner, and William Baker, an industry scientist who at the time had been leading Bell Labs. Our board appoints, but without sponsor approval, 2 key committees: a research committee, which selects all of our research competitively. I'll get to this more in a minute. And a separate review committee with all the same expertise that intensively peer reviews all results. And one key element is that we believe in full transparency of our work. So we publish all results, both positive and negative, along with a detailed commentary by the HAI Review Committee. And we also work to make all data accessible to others. Importantly, HI does not take policy positions based on its work. So we've been around for a while. We've funded a large number of studies, over 350 on a wide variety of air pollutants. Those studies have included exposure studies, toxicology, epidemiology, and the thorough peer review and commentary before publication. We also periodically conduct detailed reviews of the literature. Just earlier this year, we published a new report on the health effects of exposure to traffic. And we do have a global health program funded by foundations and multinational agencies. We started in work in North America and Europe, but we are doing ongoing research and science communication in China, India, Africa, and other low and middle income countries. And also, we've recently started something called HEI Energy, which is examining the potential exposures and health impacts of unconventional oil and gas development, or fracking. So how do we take this diverse sponsorship and work to produce and communicate trusted science? There are three elements: strategic planning and rigorous competition to produce quality, policy relevant science, broad transparency of the results, data, and methods, and no policy advocacy. Every 5 years, we put together, with input from a wide range of not only our sponsors, but the scientific community, environmental organizations, and others, the HEI strategic plan, which is designed not to be a general statement of overall principles. Those are there in the plan, but a very detailed plan for what should be happening to anticipate future policy and technology events, and to then produce the science that can inform those. It does evolve over time. Under our current plan, when we produced it in 2019 and 2020, we did not, for example, have any research plan for air pollution and its relationship to COVID. We have a number of those studies up and running now. So it's not a straitjacket, but it's a carefully designed a set of priorities for how we best invest our money. And that plan then feeds into a very detailed process, which is not in some ways that different from the process that we just heard about from NIH, but in other ways it is different. So we use that to identify key research priorities. Our research committee then produces a request for applications, competitive ones, and go through a very similar two-stage process with an ad hoc review panel, and then the committee itself deciding which research to fund, and then they oversee the research. The committee is made up of scientists, all of whom have their own conflict of interest disclosures and cannot be from any of the sponsor organizations. So they're independent of that. At the end of that research, after detailed oversight, quality assurance auditing, a comprehensive report of findings is issued to our review committee, which has all of the same expertise, exposure, toxicology, statistics, epidemiology, but they conduct a very intensive peer review, including outside reviewers, in order to then summarize and communicate the findings. There's an iteration with the investigators to do that, and then we widely disseminate those results, increasingly through social media and other channels, not just through publications. Although all of our reports are published on PubMed and widely disseminated in the scientific community. The transparency comes in two ways. First of all, our PIs are always free to publish in scientific journals. We have a very high rate of articles published by our investigators, and that may be before our review process or after our review process. And we are made aware of those, but we do not in any way review those. But they also must produce this comprehensive final report of all analyses performed. And that enables our review committee to understand yes, there are positive findings, but are there negative findings? And if so, how do you judge what are the appropriate ways to interpret this science, and how do they then inform key policy decisions? We've also had, for many years, long before even the Shelby amendments in the Congress, a requirement for making all of our data accessible for review. Our review committee has access to it, but investigators are expected to make that data available much more broadly. And in some cases, we've actually funded the publishing online of full data sets, which have then generated dozens of additional papers based on that data. That has always, from the beginning, seemed to us a critical element of ensuring that this is seen as transparent, independent research. From our inception, our board recognized that we needed to be able to produce policy-relevant science to inform what are often controversial decisions. If HEI's work, our view is that if our work is not used to support smarter decisions, then we haven't really succeeded in what we were trying to do. But we do not take policy positions. I was once asked by the chair of a Senate committee and I had been invited by both the Republicans and the Democrats to testify what I thought the national ambient air quality standard should be for fine particulate matter. And I proceeded to say that we produce the science, but it's up to EPA and the larger process to decide what that level should be. And the concern there was that if one were to take a position, then any subsequent research we might fund and publish might be viewed through a lens of whether it is just being done to support that previously taken position. So let me give you a few examples. I'm not going to, as I said, we've funded 350 studies, but 3 cogent examples. First, in the late 90s, when EPA was considering a new standard on fine particle air pollution, 2 studies, the Harvard 6-City study and the American Cancer Society study, were at the center of that. A reanalysis of that was called for by EPA, by industry, by Congress, and the investigators themselves came to us and offered the full available access to the data. And so we conducted a complete independent reanalysis with access to all the data, sensitivity analyses and others, by a new team that had not been involved in the original research. And we did confirm that the work was of the highest quality and integrity, and the results, even when tested with other sensitivity analyses, stood out. A second example is something we call the multi-center ozone study on older adults, or MOSES. It was actually originally named the multi-center ozone study on elderly subjects, but there was a lot of concern that since some of the subjects were 50 plus, it was hard to call them elderly. But there were significant questions about the time of whether there are cardiovascular effects of exposure to ozone. It was understood that there are respiratory effects. And this involved nearly 90 older adults exposed to ambient and higher levels in 3 centers around the United States with a very, very carefully defined protocol along the way. And it did find and confirm in these older adults the respiratory effects of ozone. A few studies had done that before, but it did not find evidence of cardiovascular effects in those. And that's an important understanding that EPA continues to use in its decision-making. And third, but not least, there were limited studies about 8 to 10 years ago showing associations of exposure to fine particulate air pollution at very, very low levels. But they had limitations, and we convened at the urging of all of our sponsors. We competitively chose 3 teams to examine the effects of one of the teams looking at the effects on 68 million Medicare recipients in the United States, a second looking at the effects in 8 million Canadian census participants, and a third looking at effects in 25 million Europeans across a wide variety of cohorts. And those results published in the last 2 years have actually shown evidence of associations at quite low levels. And they are right in the center as we speak of decisions in the at US EPA and in the White House for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the US, and in Brussels for the European-wide air quality limit values. So we've seen our work be accepted in those various settings. There have been attempts to replicate the concept, and I'll briefly touch on those. In the early 1980s, Congress helped establish the Health Effects Institute Asbestos Research because asbestos was being removed from schools, and there was controversy over whether it should be removed from commercial and residential buildings. An independent expert panel reviewed the existing science and recommended strong steps to minimize exposure and effects. And more recently, there was intense controversy over exposure and effects from fracking activity, and the Health Effects Institute Energy, a subsidiary pattern on the same processes, currently has targeted air, noise, and water exposure research underway across the US. So let me wrap up. These kinds of activities start with controversy and distrust between the major parties, and that's what led to this public-private leverage partnership for research investment. We've tried to design it and implement it for maximum impartiality and credibility, with sponsor input into priorities, but no involvement in study selection, oversight, or review. It's guided by a carefully drawn, responsive strategic research plan, and the renewal of that plan and funding each 5 years provides an opportunity to refresh and refocus the research, but it also ensures that sponsors cannot be dissatisfied with one or another study and then just pull out their funding prematurely. And the results are many, many research studies, reanalyses, and systematic literature reviews, which are widely cited in the literature and in policy regulatory deliberations. So I'll stop there and be glad to take any questions you might have. And I assume maybe I should stop my sharing to do that.
Thanks, Dan. That was really great. I appreciate hearing about all that. Quick clarification point from me while we wait to see if anybody else has any quick questions. You mentioned that you don't do policy advocacy, but I assume that it might be challenging for you to prevent the people whose you give money to do the research from engaging in, drawing conclusions in the, in the papers that they publish, or in saying something different in front of a congressional committee. So I guess I was just wondering how you balance that, or do you try to be involved with that?
That's a very good question, and we obviously don't challenge specific things that our investigators might say in an individual paper. I will comment first by saying that I myself have written editorials in epidemiologic journals indicating that one of the least effective ways to influence policy is to make add a policy sentence to the end of your paper. You can do it, you're fine to do it, but that is not how policy gets made by any one study. It usually has to do with a synthesis of all of the relevant information. But we do sometimes see situations less from the individual investigators and more from regulatory agencies who may choose to accept, quote parts of our work, but not all of our conclusions. And we will, and we've also seen that from, for example, industry advocates involved in our work, where they will pick the piece of our conclusions on the work that are most favorable to them, but leave out the caveats or the other comments we make. And we have actually written and clarified and indicated what HEI is saying and not saying in those situations. So we try and maintain less with our investigators and more with if some of our sponsors choose to use it in a certain way, or certain agencies choose to use it in a certain way, making sure that our work is is interpreted as fully as possible.